Welcome to the study. This is Brofessor Hemlock here. Today I want to go over what I've been doing for the last 3 weeks, and that is playing Kyrian. So today I want to do a little guide on how I like to play Kyrian, as well as my thoughts on Kyrian and how it kind of plays into the Arcane spec. Let's start off with a quick and simple guide. So first off, with Kyrian, you do want to be Pelagos. The combat meditation slot is essentially unbeatable. Next, Ire of the Ascended is the conduit you want to place in your potency, as well as Magi's Brand. These two are essentially how the build plays and functions around. Your whole DPS rotation is going to depend on these two conduits. I do, of course, like Cryo Freeze for my primary defensive conduit, and I do like shifting between Flow of Time and Diverted Energy. I'm using Flow of Time right now because my guild is progressing on Artificer, and I am a Seed Runner, and that is also why I am running Shimmer. So that is very important right now in my current setup. I do like to use Diverted Energy, or in this slot, if I'm doing Mythic Plus as my focus, I would like to use Grounding Surge, and then you can switch this out to Slipstream as you feel necessary. Okay. Pretty straightforward, though. The build, other than that, plays exactly as you would expect. You're going to run Resonance in Raid. You're going to run Resonance in Mythic Plus. That is a little bit different than other builds, where in Raid you run Arcane Echo, and you run Resonance in Mythic Plus. This, you'll want to run Resonance all the time. And that's going to come into play when we talk about more on the DPS rotation. Okay. You are running Overpowered and Rune. Again, this build kind of funnels all of its damage into cooldowns. Since you're funneling all your damage into cooldowns, you do like to use that Overpowered and Rune setup. Okay. Now, going into the DPS rotation here, there's really two big things. Okay. First off, the most important thing is nothing to do with the DPS rotation. It is to do with your secondary stats. Haste is extremely impactful on this build, and having certain levels of haste create breakpoints in how the build functions. So I want to think this is probably the most important part of the build, is understanding where your haste is and how to play with your haste levels. Okay, super important. So personally, I have found I like to have between 6 and 8% haste for this build. The reason I like 6 to 8% haste will become clear here in a second. So essentially, the Touch of the Magi window is where you're going to do all of your DPS. So when you're going into your DPS rotation, your goal is to either do 5 Arcane Blasts into a barrage or 4 Arcane Blasts into a barrage. If you're doing a 3+ target cleave situation, this is Mythic Plus basically. If you're doing Mythic Plus, your DPS rotation is going to involve 4 Arcane Blasts, then a barrage. And you want to make sure that that barrage comes right as that blast from the 4th blast ends, where in single target situations, you're going to want to use 5 Arcane Blasts into a barrage. Now, let's kind of just go over what this looks like. So we'll use Touch of the Magi here, and we're going to showcase what it looks like when you have 0 haste. So let's take off my pieces of haste. I have basically no haste right now. I'm going to start casting Touch of the Magi, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and my 5th one right there, right? So I was able to get 5 Arcane Blasts in on that Touch of the Magi. But with no haste, I made it within very tight margins. We're talking 0.2 seconds. So that is a very tight DPS margin. So if you want to have a little bit more comfort, you need a little bit more haste. The more haste you have, the more you'll be able to squeeze in on that Touch of the Magi window, and it'll be a little bit more comfortable. If you have even a finger slip, if you have any movement mechanics occur, and you're doing a single target rotation, and you have 0 haste essentially, or 3% or less haste, you're essentially going to have a very rough time fitting those 5 Arcane Blasts in. And on top of that, you will never be able to sneak in the barrage. So if I'm in a single target situation where I can be up close to the mob, I have a little bit more haste, I'm going to be able to use Touch of the Magi, I'm going to be able to do my 5 blasts, and then I'm going to be able to get the barrage in. Now, since all of that damage connected, and I had enough haste to give me a little bit of leeway room, I was able to ensure that I got all of my damage inside that Touch of the Magi window. So in a single target situation, I like to have around that 8% haste range. I can get my 5 blasts in, and if I'm close enough to the target, within, I think it's like 5 to 8 yards, I'm going to be able to also connect the barrage into my Touch of the Magi window. So that means I'm going to have a very large effective damage inside my Touch of the Magi window. With how Radiant Spark functions, we are obviously going to open with Radiant Spark into Touch of the Magi, and then we're going to get as much damage bonus as we possibly can out of that Touch of the Magi window. In an AoE situation, a 3 or more target situation, things change a little bit though, okay? This is going to be more for Mythic Plus, right? Because you're going to have a lot of times where you're hitting 3 or more targets. So how Radiant Spark functions is you're going to get, after the essentially 4 spellcasts, you get bonus damage. But how it functions is you can also do a double dip. If you're familiar with Frost at all, you get to use Shatter combos, right? Where you cast Frostbolt, and then you cast Flurry directly after, and they both get a synergistic benefit from the Flurry Brain Freeze proc, and that will cause bonus damage. Well, this is very similar to that. So in an AoE situation, that barrage is going to benefit from the Radiant Spark buff. And since your barrage is going to be amplified by Radiant Spark to the maximum potential of Radiant Spark, it is going to cause a massive amount of damage to those 3 or more targets you're hitting. Hopefully it's like 5 targets, right? And how Barrage's damage functions is it scales the damage of Barrage off of the damage you deal on the primary target. So if you're hitting, say I'm going into this, and I have 18 Harmony stacks. We'll get up there. Okay, so I have 18 Harmony stacks, and I go into my Touch of the Magi here. I'll Radiant Spark, Touch of the Magi, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, and on my 4th one, I sink the barrage in. That barrage is going to deal a lot of damage. That was a 30,000 barrage. 30,000. That was without Rune of Power. That was without Arcane Intellect. That was without AP. I had no buffs, and I hit crit for 30,000, right? And that is what is going to make that Touch of the Magi explode for a lot of damage, right? Since it got maximum benefit out of Radiant Spark. That maximum damage would then amplify out to all 5 targets I could hit with Arcane Barrage. And then that Touch of the Magi explodes, so you get a Barrage that's amplified by Radiant Spark and a Touch of the Magi that has all of that damage inside of it. So it causes a massive AoE damage. And that is, I mean, it's off the charts. I have, in typical Mythic Plus situations where there are around 5 targets being hit by that, I will be pulling 40 to 50k DPS. It is nuts. Mind-blowing. And on that note, this build also runs 1 legendary. You run the Harmony legendary. That way, you are always maximizing that barrage window to make sure you're getting insane damage, right? Since again, this whole build functions around the Touch of the Magi window. Okay? So, now another thing to note with the haste figure, going back to this and kind of circling back, is that if you do run a little bit more haste, you can even get a little bit more comfortable with the barrage window. Personally, my preference is around that 6 to 8% haste window, so that is kind of what I'm going for in my build. Otherwise, for secondary stats, it is going to be exactly the same as every other build. You're going to want a lot of crit, you're going to want a lot of mastery, and then you're going to want to put some stats into versatility with whatever else. And of course, the number one most important thing, intellect, intellect, intellect. You got to have that high primary stat, okay? So kind of going into it, if I'm doing a single target damage rotation and I'm going to use all my cooldowns here, pretty much what it's going to look like is I'm going to want to use my on-use trinket. In this case, I'm using a Soul Letting Ruby. I'm going to want to have 18 stacks of Harmony. So you go into a build phase first, making sure you have that 18 stacks of Harmony. You use your on-use trinket, you use Radiant Spark, you use Touch of the Magi, Arcane Power, then you do 5 blasts. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we had just enough room to make it all go inside of that DPS window. And we had a large barrage in there. Whew, that was a thick barrage right there. Now, if you actually, do this rotation a little bit more effectively in a raid situation when you have all your buffs up, you use Time Warp, and then you get more Arcane Blasts inside of your barrage or your Touch of the Magi window, you're going to have huge damage. I've seen Touch of the Magi's north of 75,000 damage. 75,000 damage Touch of the Magi's. We're not talking about doing like Mists of Tir-Nasaith where you get the damage bonus off the first boss. We are talking normal situations in a raid encounter. That's how crazy this build is. It does so much damage off those Touch of the Magi windows. And that kind of goes into the playstyle. So your cycling of things, like let's kind of go back to Mythic Plus, right? So Mythic Plus, you're relying on Touch of the Magi to do your big AoE damage. Now, after you've done your Touch of the Magi, and there may be a mob left or maybe 2 mobs left, what's really important at the end is to just go into a missile spam, making sure you're able to start that next pack with an 18 stack of Harmony. And then you can essentially go into a full barrage. If you don't have 4 charges, make sure you also orb to get to 4 charges, or if your Touch of the Magi is back off cooldown, that you then go into a Rune, Radiant Spark, Touch of the Magi, and then if it's Mythic Plus and there's a large pack of mobs, 3 or more, then you just do 4 blasts into a barrage. In Raid, your cooldown cycle pretty much is going to play the exact same. You're cycling between making sure you're having 18 stacks of Harmony, and then utilizing your AP goes with Touch of the Magi, Radiant Spark, and then making sure you're having like a in-between phase where you're then going into a secondary with 18 stacks of Harmony, Rune, Radiant Spark, Touch of the Magi, and you're kind of cycling that back and forth. Now, how can this build perform? How does it perform? What's it do? So that is something I really want to talk about here. So I am a 5 out of 10 Mythic Raider, progressing on Artificer right now. And out of all the fights where we focus on actually putting out damage, so this is not counting Sun King. Sun King is a fight where we're not looking at parses exactly because it's more about specifically funneling damage into a small window, not utilizing our cooldowns on big AoE packs. I have parsed 98, or I've parsed 94 on Enerva. I've got a couple 90 parses, and I think I have like a high 80s parse on Shriekwing. So this build performs and competes. If you've listened to my video on the state of Arcane, I did talk about how every build is competitive and can be good, and that holds true with this build. It is competitive, you will do great. And in Mythic Plus, I actually like it for a little bit of a different reason. In Mythic Plus, not only is it competitive on the DPS meters, but where I really like it is it has very high effective damage. So a lot of the times when tanks pull large groups of mobs, whether it's Fortified or Tyrannical Weak, they pull large groups of mobs, they use their defensive cooldowns on the initial start of the pull. So it's very important that when you take a large group of mobs, your tank uses a defensive cooldown on the initial start of the pull, that you have a lot of those mobs dead, or some of them dead, to make sure that once the tank's major defensive cooldown falls, that they won't have so many mobs alive that they have now no defensive cooldowns, and you have to sink either more cooldowns into that that pack of mobs. Say the healer now has to blow a cooldown, or the tank has to blow a second defensive cooldown. You want to ensure that you're able to kill mobs effectively and quickly. And that is where this build excels. You have the absolute nuts damage from the top. So if you're going into a big pack, you're going to actually be doing single target damage, right? So you're going to be putting a bunch of damage with a massive barrage and then 4 fully charged arcane blasts into a target. So that target is often going to fall very rapidly. Since that target's going to fall very rapidly, it'll offer your tank some breathing room, especially if you put it on the most dangerous target. So if there is a specific mob that needs to die before other mobs, Kyrian is going to be very, very good because we're going to have the ability to decimate that target. Only Necrolord truly has that kind of absolute detonation on one target, and Kyrian is still the most powerful Covenant in that sense. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about effective DPS, and that is where Kyrian really excels in Mythic Plus. One of the other benefits that I like about it is just how powerful the single target damage is in small windows. So especially on Tyrannical Week with Mythic Plus, you're going to go into fights with most often a Pride buff, and some of the time, Time Warp. When you combo those effects together, and you go single target with Kyrian, it is massive. In the opening 15 seconds of a pull, I will pretty much always be pulling 20 to 25,000 single target DPS. It's crazy. This build is crazy good, okay? And it is very competitive. So now I kind of want to go into my opinions on the build as from a pure opinions perspective. I truly believe that this is how Arcane should play as far as the feel of the build. This is a personal opinion here, but I really don't like Arcane Echo as a playstyle. I think as an Arcane Mage, I like Arcane Blast being used in my primary DPS rotation. It just feels right. You get to feel the big explosion of the blast. That's how you're sinking away a bunch of your mana. And it's really what it feels like it should be. You're doing all of your damage inside that big casting window. And it feels very rewarding. In addition to that, you don't have to farm clear cast procs. Oh, I can't tell you how much I hate the RNG of clear casting procs. If you get unlucky and you don't get a clear casting proc and you've burned through 40-50% of your mana and you have to go into your burn phase without getting 3 clear casting procs, you will see a major DPS reduction. Guess what? Kyrian doesn't have that. There is no RNG to Kyrian DPS windows. When I have my 18 stacks of Harmony, which I can just hit missiles to get, I can then always use my secondary on use. I can always use Radiant Spark. I can always use Touch of the Magi. And I can always follow that into a big AP go. It's consistent. It feels how the spec should play. And that is kind of why it is definitely my personal favorite Covenant to play. It feels how Arcane should play. So if you are someone who is looking to have that kind of play style, that more consistent feel to the Arcane spec, this build is absolutely the build you want to play. I think the only consistency you'll get that feels close to Kyrian is going to be Venthyr, where the mirrors gives you the guaranteed clear casting procs. Those are really the 2 most consistent builds, but again, I'm more of a fan of spamming Arcane Blast than I am seeing the small echo explosions. That's obviously more of a personal feel, and I love how Kyrian plays. So I kind of want to wrap the video up here. If you're interested in more, or you have more questions on the build, please slap it down in the comments. I'd love to help everyone out if you have any questions, or if you want to ask more on my opinions on the build compared to other builds. Hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for coming to the study, and we'll see you next time.